Towns and distant counties, many with Hispanic or Native American roots, cockfighting remains a noble activity, an ancient inheritance, and a mark of stubborn resistance against a wider culture that has little regard for rural lives. In the suburbs and cities, it elicits horror and most prominently embarrassment. One might think that mutual tolerance could address these differences into mutual benefit. It would enable one side to secure protection for a cherished tradition and recognition for the difference in merit of lives that still trade in dirt and death. At the same time, it would allow high-tech suburbanites and cosmopolitan city dwellers to retain their horror, while at the same time encouraging both to abandon their embarrassment. But the matter has resolved itself as Fletcher predicts, citing the unacceptable harm cockfighting does to the roosters who fight and the subtle moral threats it poses to the citizens who watch. The state of Oklahoma banned cockfighting by referendum in 2002. New Mexico followed suit in 2007. Louisiana in 2008. There's no state in the nation that allows cockfighting. Fletcher's hunch that debates about objectionable difference tend to tack back and forth between acceptance and difference and legal coercion while ignoring the rigors of tolerance can also be seen in the Supreme Court's response to peyote use in the Native American Church. As with cockfighting, what might be considered merely objectionable and thus potentially tolerable has been transformed by legal judgment into the unbearably harmful and potentially suppressible. In other instances, this transformation has been not so easily made. Consider the objections that the Sanitarian animal sacrifice has elicited in South Florida. Harms have been cataloged and ordinances passed, but in each instance, the courts have ruled against those who wish to restrict this activity, largely because the harms offered in justification have been both insubstantial and ordinary. In certain settings, the animals used in Sanitarian sacrifice may well pose real threats to public health, but these threats so closely resemble those that accompany dairy farming and chicken ranching that one suspects the ordinances were passed to suppress the merely objectionable, not the intolerably harmful. Still, when the dynamic that Fletcher describes fails in this way, some other response to objectionable difference will no doubt emerge, and if his hunch is right, it will not be tolerance. Indifference will grow, perhaps acceptance, and if neither of these emerges, then no doubt some other response will circumvent the suffering endured by the tolerant as they endeavor to do what, in the end, he insists they cannot do, restrain their desire to act intolerantly toward the activities they find objectionable. Now, surely there's some truth in what Fletcher says. Tolerance is often difficult to muster. Objecting to this or that, wishing to intervene, and at the same time restraining that desire. This can be painful, it can be an unstable state of mind. What's more, if Fletcher's remarks about tolerance are taken to be authoritative and exhaustive, then surely his account encourages its critics to complain. Objectionable difference abounds, and tolerance is often recommended as a solution to the problems of association that follow in turn. At the same time, we are told that tolerance states of mind are unstable. They are not easily sustained. Those of us who try to sustain them frequently lapse into indifference or acceptance. These attitudes will, of course, generate practices that resemble tolerance. We will live and let live, but not because we've managed to combine objection and restraint, but rather because we believe nothing with conviction, or, failing that, because we accept uncritically what our recent ancestors, courageous and upright, would have found abominable, intolerable. Either way, the tolerance we are encouraged to exercise and practice conspires against our own meager virtue and lands us in a contemptible nihilism, a flabby, traitorous condition. On this account, tolerance is a kind of vice in disguise. It encourages us to keep company with the vicious even as we act among the tolerant. Given the praise it receives nevertheless, why not resent it? Add to these commitments and inferences the common belief that tolerance is found exclusively in modern liberal societies, societies that some say encourage this kind of moral collapse in all important human affairs, and this resentment is confirmed in a broader landscape of assumption and criticism. Of course, these are not Fletcher's inferences and conclusions. He aims neither to praise nor to bury tolerance, but simply to point out its instability. Still, its most common critics assume that those who encourage tolerance of difference in fact recommend moral collapse, and Fletcher gives comfort to these critics as he confirms this assumption. I'm going to skip over some pages that talk about Locke and talk about critics on the left who read Locke's famous account of tolerance and see embedded in it a subtle plea for state authority. Okay. Roughly what Locke says is, look, you can tolerate indifferent things. Indifferent things are matters that don't bear directly on life and health and property, things that the civil magistrate, basically the state, has authority over. But the question is, who gets to decide what an indifferent thing is? And in Locke's rendering, it's the state, right? And so his example is washing a child with water. Washing a child with water is an indifferent thing. And thus, if you object to the way your neighbor is washing children with water in the church down the street, he's talking about baptism, right? You have no reason to complain. It's an indifferent matter. And the state gets to decide. If, however, there's a water shortage, then suddenly washing children with water is no longer an indifferent matter. It's a matter of deep civil concern, and the state can regulate it. What critics, both actually on the left and the right, have seen embedded, and so there's someone like someone like Wendy Brown, someone like Stanley Fish, and certain evangelical critics that I've been reading, all of them despise Locke largely because of this expanded rule he gives to state authority to determine what in fact can be tolerated and what in fact cannot be. And then I try to link this discussion of Locke with the discussion of Fletcher that I just laid out with you. Time's running short, so I wanted to skip over that. What I want to argue now is that it's not at all clear that Fletcher's remarks, going back to Fletcher, exhaust all there is to say about tolerance, or that the inferences its critics might make from those remarks are in fact justified. Consider first the psychological dynamic that Fletcher describes. Surely he's right. Quite often it is difficult to object and endure at the same time, and many of us will seek to avoid this difficulty by casting about for some other attitude toward objectionable activities and things. At the same time, it's not at all clear that this ordinary moral weakness of ours warrants Fletcher's conclusion that tolerance is too unstable to recommend as one possible solution to the problem posed by disagreement and difference. If we assume that tolerance is a natural human excellence, and this is going to have to be an assumption. I have an argument to this effect in the book, but you're just going to have to assume it for now. We can talk about this later if you'd like. If we assume that tolerance is a natural human excellence, if we place it among the other moral virtues, we soon discover that the psychological dynamics that Fletcher surveys are among the characteristics that distinguish the virtues in general, not tolerance in particular. Toss tolerance among the virtues, and the dynamics that Fletcher describes and assigns to tolerance in fact stick to the virtues in general. And if this is right, then Fletcher's doubts about tolerance are hardly warranted. If this is right, then the inferences from difficulty to complaint and from instability to resentment are hardly justified. Or put another way, if his doubts about tolerance are warranted because of the psychological dynamics it shares with the other virtues, then we would expect him to express doubts about justice and courage and the rest. But of course, he doesn't. We would also expect toleration's critics to extend their complaints and resentments to these other virtues, which of course they don't. Place tolerance among the virtues, and we soon discover that its instabilities are hardly unique, just as the moral traps it lays for those weak in virtue are hardly exceptional. At the same time, we will discover that tolerance does have a special relation to its semblances, to actions that look like toleration, but in fact are not, but in fact are vices. Toleration has a special relation with its vices, with its semblances. And it's precisely this combination of the psychological dynamics that it shares with the virtues in general, combine that with its special relation to its semblances. Combine those two pieces, and you get, it seems to me, the psychological account of resentment toward tolerance. Consider then the virtues in general, and begin with Aristotle's authoritative treatment in Book 2 of the Ethics. In general, all of the virtues fulfill roughly the same function. All perfect our ability to know, desire, and act for the sake of those things that are, on the one hand, choice-worthy, and on the other, difficult to know, desire, and achieve. Were these things not choice-worthy, we would have no reason to love them or pursue them in action. Were they not difficult to know, love, and achieve, we would not need to be perfected by habit in order to respond to them well and pursue them in action. As we do many things, many habits are needed to perfect our agency. And each habit is distinguished from every other by the good it regards and the difficulty it addresses. Thus, for example, there is the good that can be achieved in human affairs when we give to others what is their due. At the same time, most of us know what Aristotle's greatest interpreter points out, that it's quite often difficult to find and establish the rational means that would give to others what they are in fact due in this or that circumstance. And it is for precisely this reason that we need those intellectual virtues, prudence in particular, that guide our inquiries and perfect our judgments. By the same token, there are, as everyone knows, certain obstacles to the establishment of this rectitude in human affairs. Above all, passions that too often confound our ability to judge well about the right and the good, and that too often suspend our willingness to follow better judgment to right intention, sound choice, and praiseworthy action. For this reason, we need temperance and courage and the other virtues that perfect our relations to the various objects that precipitate our various passions. And finally, since most of us find it difficult to desire right relations in each of our many affairs and to do so with the constancy of habit, most of us need our souls transformed by justice. Notice what follows once we grant that the moral virtues regard the difficult and the good, and that's Aristotle's little punchline, his little pithy little formula. The virtues regard good things that we desire, that we have difficulty desiring right and achieving well. The virtuous are those who pursue the good, habitually, promptly, and with pleasure, despite the fact that difficulties of various kinds threaten to interrupt their various pursuits. This absence of instability is in part what their perfection involves, and this constancy of character is what it means to say that they are strong, that they act at the limit of their powers. The courageous, for example, respond well, not simply to ordinary difficulties and commonplace dangers, but also to the most demanding difficulties and the most pressing dangers. Confronted with these grave threats, they respond with fear and daring in right order, which in turn enables them to judge well and to act for the sake of the good that they know to be best. The obstacles to right action posed by these threats and by the disordered passions they tend to elicit are quite literally overcome by the courageous, by their habitual disposition to respond in each instance with passion of the right kind and intensity. Indeed, for the courageous, these obstacles to just and courageous conduct are hardly obstacles at all. By contrast, those of us with little or no virtue will find real obstacles to the good we hope to achieve and the happiness we hope to have in the difficulties and dangers of this world. When we are told that we must be courageous, that we should give virtue a try, we are put off by its rigors. More often than not, our meager, unstable virtue collapses under this challenge, and we recast our account of the circumstances of choice and thus diminish our need for a virtuous response. We might conclude that the end we had hoped to achieve, the end that demands resort to a courageous act, is in fact a matter of indifference, not desire. Or if that proves impossible, we might pursue this end, but then insist that the unacceptable threats posed in its pursuit are in fact acceptable. The good threatened is in fact less worthy of our care and concern than we had first thought. Or we might argue that the means proposed to achieve this end, means that present difficulties and dangers of various kinds, are far from best. Some other, less arduous course of action would be a better choice. All of these tactics are well known. All are designed to excuse us from acting as the virtuous do. All circumvent virtue's demands by deception, and all produce moral postures that are subject to unmasking. If this is right, then it appears that instability afflicts every virtue that falls short of perfection, not simply tolerance. And this shared affliction appears to be an ordinary consequence of the difficulties that every virtue regards. Given this ordinary feature of the virtues in general, the tendency of tolerance to dissolve into some other moral posture hardly justifies Fletcher's doubts about the virtue as a source of civil peace. Courage, justice, and the rest display similar tendencies, and yet no one appeals to this fact in order to suggest that we can or should proceed without them. Rather, most of us acknowledge the difficulty of thinking, feeling, and acting as the virtuous do in precisely those circumstances of extremity that most urgently requires virtue's act. Most concede that we fall short of moral perfection most of the time, and that we squirm out of virtue's demands more often than we care to admit. Still, in a cool hour, most of us recognize the virtues for what they are, for the goods they instantiate in themselves, and for the benefits they secure when they succeed. In fits of justice and charity, we take note of those who lay hold of these goods and obtain these benefits, and we grant them the honors they deserve. But of course, a cool hour slips away, fits pass, difficulties mount, and most of us return to dodging the demands of this or that virtue and resenting the fact that we fall short of its measure. This species of resentment is an ordinary consequence of the difficulties that every virtue confronts. And it's important to see that this species does not deny the merit of the perfection it regards. The imperfect resent the perfect because of the difficulties that divide them. And the resentment bears witness to the fact that they recognize the authority of that perfection and their own failure to measure up. Theirs is not the kind of resentment that we find directed toward tolerance itself, where the virtue is despised not as an arduous excellence, but as a vice in disguise. Both kinds of resentment follow from the difficulty and instability of virtue in general, but the instability that afflicts tolerance generates actions that encourage us to confuse the virtue and its semblances, the real thing and its opposing vices dressed in virtue's garb. It's this unusual consequence of virtue's ordinary instability that distinguishes tolerance from most other virtues. And it's precisely this confusion that causes a good portion of the resentment that attaches to the virtue itself. No doubt, semblances of virtue are often mistaken for the real coin, but as far as I can tell, this common confusion rarely follows from the difficulties and instabilities that afflict the virtues in general. And once it does emerge by other means with respect to other virtues, it does not, as far as I can tell, diminish our regard for them. If you go to Aristotle's treatment of courage, right, he has a couple of short paragraphs on what courage is, and then a long list of its semblances. Semblances he recognizes that we could be confused about. But he doesn't assume that those semblances, right, will make us resent the virtue itself. The argument about toleration is slightly different. It goes like this. As a virtue, tolerance regards those activities and things that fall between two extremes, as I've said, between the unbearably harmful on the one hand and the harmlessly objectionable on the other. The tolerant, the truly virtuous, know which activities and things fall within this domain, and they respond to each as each deserves. Like all virtuous persons, they act with the constancy of habit, with ease and pleasure, with one eye on the good they hope to achieve and another on the good they find in the act of virtue itself. But of course, most of us aren't virtuous. Most of us have little virtue, and what we have falls short of perfection. We act tolerantly in response to objectionable differences of modest consequence, but struggle with those that matter. When we succeed, it's only as we restrain ourselves, only as we choke down our outrage and stifle our desire to oppose the differences we despise. And most of us find this act of self-restraint too difficult to muster most of the time. How can one despise, really, and endure at the same time? So, more often than not, our imperfect tolerance, like our deficient courage, collapses into vicious moral postures. Confronted by the grave and important difficulties that the tolerant address well, by judgments that are difficult to make and differences that are painful to endure, those of us with little and imperfect virtue abandon our objection to what we at first and quite rightly found odious, and instead cultivate some other attitude, perhaps indifference, perhaps acceptance. And notice, and this is the key, notice the vice cultivated, accepting what you shouldn't accept, being indifferent to what you should not be indifferent to. The vice cultivated is a semblance of the virtue, not the absence of its act. In most instances, the indifferent and the accepting act roughly as the tolerant do. They live and let live, but not from tolerant habits and motives. They dodge the virtue, but not the act. What follows is the now common confusion of tolerance with a couple of its semblances, of the real thing with some of its opposing vices dressed in virtue's clothing. Other virtues have semblances that enable the morally mediocre to act among the virtuous from time to time, but few deteriorate under the demands of virtue's difficulty into a moral posture that can produce a semblance of virtue's act. Courage, again, has semblances such as fearlessness that give the appearance of courage in character and deed, right? The person who's fearless. That's one of Aristotle's examples of an action that looks like courage but in fact is not. How do you know that fearlessness is not virtue, not courage? Imagine you're a soldier. Imagine you're the lieutenant leading your platoon has no fear. You're doomed, right? This guy's going to drag you, or this woman's going to drag you into the worst circumstances, right? You want them rather to fear the right things. And yet their fearlessness will look like courage. Aristotle says, yeah, but it's not. Courage has semblances such as fearlessness that give the appearance of courage and character. Appearance of courage and character indeed, and yet imperfect courage tends to collapse into fearful moral postures that are incapable of producing actions that resemble those caused by genuine courage. The person who really lacks courage, for the most part, they're going to be fearful, and their actions won't look courageous. Whereas the person who lacks tolerance, they might be indifferent, they might be accepting, and those attitudes will generate actions that look like the true patient endurance of the tolerant. Imperfect tolerance tends to collapse under the difficulties it must address into moral postures that enable those without the virtue to act as the tolerant do, at least for the most part. As perfect tolerance is rare and painful differences many, most assume that tolerance is nothing but these postures, nothing but blithe indifference that quickly melts into vile acceptance. Indeed, most of its critics are quick to assume that tolerance simply is this moral collapse. And of course, fearing moral collapse, some not only decry tolerance, but they flee to the other boundary of toleration's domain. Looking for a solution to the problems of association that disagreement and difference invariably generate, unable to combine objection and endurance as the virtuous do, and appalled by the easy indifference and contemptible acceptance that so often is mistaken for tolerance, they reduce the objectionable and yet potentially tolerable to the unbearably harmful and possibly dangerous. They become advocates of law and order, of coercion and constraint. Such is our lot, it seems to me. Moral collapse or heavy-handed paternalism. These are the options that tolerance offers those of us who are morally mediocre and who cannot, as a result, resist the instability that comes packaged with virtue's difficulty. And yet many are convinced that these vices are essential to tolerance itself, not consequences of ordinary instability and common weakness. They are, after all, toleration's most common yield. Tolerance must then be a vice, just as the praise it receives, nevertheless, must be resented and its admirers resisted. My claim is that resentment that rests on a confusion, on the inability to distinguish true tolerance from its semblances, is hardly justified. What's needed is a better account of the virtue tolerance, one that helps us escape this confusion. That account, it seems to me, will have at least three parts. First, every account of tolerance must include a discussion of its limits, of the indifferent and the acceptable on the one hand, and of the intolerable and thus coercible on the other. And note, this discussion scarcely amounts to criticism. To say that tolerance has limits is not to eliminate tolerance. It is rather an attempt to specify the domain of virtue's act. Second, because every account of tolerance comes loaded with concrete judgments about the tolerable and the intolerable, every account is open to dispute, not about tolerance itself, but about its substance, scope, and limits. This is inevitable. Third, because tolerance is a virtue, the best way to resolve these disputes is to cultivate and acquire the habit of acting tolerantly. Why? Because we say that a person is tolerant when they are accepting, indifferent, enduring, and constraining with respect to the right actions and things in the right circumstances and to the right degree. Indeed, right judgment about concrete matters such as these is the very soul of this and every other moral virtue. But this means that tolerance itself cannot be justly resented simply because it includes these judgments, or because they are difficult to make, or because the conflicts and disagreements that tolerance is expected to address are frequently produced in our debates and contests over its substance, scope, and limits. Such is the way we live now. At the same time, we should keep in mind that the dynamic of tolerance that I've described here, the dynamic that Fletcher endorses, and the psychological dynamic that I've uncovered, reaches beyond tolerance to justice, its home and principle. And while we might, in some instance, bemoan the dynamic, where the weakness that most of us carry with us that prevents us from acting tolerantly generates actions that resemble tolerance but in fact aren't, and thus encourages resentment toward it. That this dynamic reaches beyond tolerance to justice, its home and principle. And while we might in some instances bemoan the dynamic, few of us bewail justice. Those of us with ordinary measures of justice built into our souls surely dodge its difficulties more often than we should. We reduce judgments about the just and the unjust to calculations of utility. We sidestep rights and ignore wrongs. Still, few regard justice with contempt simply because of this instability. Why then should we regard tolerance differently? If lament we must, then we should consider how few of us respond as the tolerant do to the differences that give us the most difficulty, that cause us the most pain when endured. At the same time, we can't take this lament to a fever pitch without resenting the virtue or bemoaning its arduous excellence. What we can decry is philosophers who encourage complaints and critics who provoke resentment simply because they overlook how tolerance stands among the moral virtues and how the virtues in general stand among various difficulties. Thank you.
John, thank you very much for a rich paper. I think we have time for